Dust devils danced across the parched earth, swirling red dirt against the bleached wood storefronts of salvation. The town, aptly named by some desperate soul, looked anything but saved. Cole rode in slow, his horse's hooves drumming a hollow rhythm against the packed dirt road. Head come seeking quiet, a place to bury the ghosts that rode alongside him. But this silence felt heavy, unnatural. The saloon door swung open with a mournful creak, releasing a stale breath of whiskey and despair. A barkeep, face etched with lines deeper than the canyons out west, wiped the dusty glass with a dirtier rag. He barely glanced at Cole. "Whiskey," he grunted, the question less an offer than a statement. Cole nodded, dismounting and looping the reins around the hitching post. The leather creaked, a sound as dry and brittle as the air. Inside, the saloon was dim, illuminated only by a single oil lamp casting long shadows that danced with the dust motes. Two men sat hunched over a table in the corner, their voices low and hushed. Cole took a seat at the bar, the wood warm beneath his calloused fingers. The whiskey arrived, amber liquid in a chipped glass. Cole took a long swallow, the burn familiar and welcome. "Quiet town," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. The barkeep snorted. "Quiet ain't the word for it. Haunted, more like." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Folks been disappearing, vanishing into thin air. Started a few months back, just after the mine collapsed." Cole raised an eyebrow. "Mine collapse? Copper mine, north of here. Whole damn thing caved in. Took half the town with it. Bodies never recovered." The barkeep shivered, despite the heat. "Some say the mountain took him. Others say something else." He trailed off, glancing nervously towards the swinging saloon doors. A gust of wind rattled them, sending a shiver down Cole's spine. He looked out at the swirling dust devils, the empty street, the closed-up shops. Salvation felt less like a town and more like a tomb. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of held breaths, of secrets buried deep. Had come looking for peace, but he suspected had found something else entirely. Something that stirred the ghosts within him instead of laying them to rest. The saloon door swung open again, this time with more force. A man strode in, large and imposing, his Stetson casting a shadow over his hard features. Jedediah Hale, cattle baron, landowner, and the closest thing salvation had to a king. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to obedience. Two men followed him in, shadows clinging to their heels like loyal hounds. A hush fell over the saloon. The two men in the corner went silent, their cards forgotten. Even the barkeep seemed to shrink back, his movements suddenly hesitant. Jedediah's gaze swept across the room, landing finally on a woman seated at a small table by the window. She was young, maybe 20, with fiery red hair pulled back severely from her face. Her dress, plain and practical, was covered with a dusting of chalk. A schoolteacher, Cole guessed. She sat ramrod straight, her chin held high, even under Jedediah's intense scrutiny. "Sarah," Jedediah's voice boomed, filling the saloon. "We need to talk." The woman Sarah didn't flinch. "We have nothing to talk about, Jedediah." Her voice, though quiet, was clear and unwavering. Jedediah took a step closer, his shadow falling over her table. "3 Apache girls. Runaways. You're harboring them." Sarah's hand tightened around the chipped teacup in front of her. "They're not runaways. They were taken. Stolen. Stolen from their rightful place," Jedediah countered, his voice laced with cold steel. "The reservation. Where they belong." "They belong with their people," Sarah retorted, her eyes blazing. "Not penned up like cattle." Tense silence filled the saloon. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Jedediah's men shifted uneasily, their hands hovering near their holsters. "You're interfering, Sarah," Jedediah said softly, dangerously. "This is none of your concern." "They are my concern," Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze never wavering. "They're children, and I won't stand by and watch them be taken again." Jedediah let out a short, harsh laugh. "You think you can stand against me, little schoolteacher? Against me and everything I represent in this town?" He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "You're playing a dangerous game." Sarah didn't back down. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Some games," she whispered, "are worth playing." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken challenge. Cole watched, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his revolver beneath his coat, the ghosts of his past stirring within him. This quiet town, this salvation, held more darkness than he'd bargained for, and something told him he was about to be drawn into it. The whispers started subtly, like the rustle of dry leaves in a rising wind. They snaked through the dusty streets of Salvation, slithering into the saloons and general stores, clinging to the starched collars of churchgoers on Sunday mornings. 3 Apache girls, barely women, swollen with child. Shameful. Unnatural. And Jedediah Hale, the cattle baron who owned the town lock, stock and barrel, was at the center of it all. "Hale's bastards," one grizzled prospector muttered in the saloon, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the sawdust-covered floor. "Saw him sneaking around the reservation months back. Said he was negotiating grazing rights." He snorted. "Negotiating something all right." Darkeep, polishing a glass with the same dirty rag, leaned in conspiratorially. "Heard tell one of the girls is carrying twins. Poor things. Barely more than children themselves." The whispers grew louder, fueled by fear and righteous indignation. Some blamed the girls, their Apache blood a convenient scapegoat for the town's unease. Others, bolder, pointed their fingers at Jedediah, their voices hushed, but laced with venom. Jedediah, however, remained unmoved, his face a granite mask, his power unshaken. Sarah, meanwhile, became a shield for the girls, deflecting the whispers with a fierce protectiveness. She housed them in the small schoolhouse, teaching them not only reading and writing, but also the quiet strength of resilience. She met the townsfolk stares head-on, her blue eyes blazing with defiance. "They're not to blame," she'd say, her voice ringing clear in the hushed church hall. "They were taken advantage of, preyed upon. But they're savages," Mrs. Perkins, the preacher's wife, hissed, clutching her Bible like a weapon. "Heathens. They'll taint our town." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "They're children, Mrs. Perkins. Children who need our help, not our judgment." The whispers didn't cease, but they shifted, becoming tinged with a grudging respect for the schoolteacher who dared to stand up to Jedediah Hale. The quiet admiration didn't translate to open support, however. Fear of Jedediah's wrath ran too deep. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Sarah sat on the porch of the schoolhouse, watching the girls tend to the small garden shed helped them plan. Their bellies, swollen beneath their simple dresses, were a testament to the violence they'd endured. Yet, in their eyes, Sarah saw not shame, but a quiet strength, a flicker of hope. She knew the whispers wouldn't disappear, that the shadows of Jedediah's power would continue to loom over them. But she also knew that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance, the quietest whispers of resistance, could bloom into something powerful. Something that could, perhaps, even begin to heal the wounds of a broken town. The next morning, Jedediah's shadow fell across the schoolhouse door like a shroud. He stood there, framed by the harsh morning sun, his Stetson low over his eyes, two shadows flanking him like silent sentinels. Sarah met his gaze through the open doorway, her hand resting lightly on the worn wooden desk behind her. The three girls huddled behind her, their dark eyes wide with fear. "You're making a mistake, Sarah," Jedediah said, his voice low and menacing. "A big mistake." Sarah didn't flinch. "The only mistake I've made is underestimating the depths of your cruelty, Jedediah." His jaw tightened. "These girls are nothing but trouble. Savages. They'll bring nothing but shame on this town." "They're carrying your children, Jedediah," Sarah retorted, her voice ringing with a quiet fury. "They're carrying the proof of your depravity." A muscle twitched in his cheek. He took a step closer, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden porch. "You think you can protect them? You think you can stand against me?" He gestured towards the silent men behind him. "I own this town, Sarah. Every inch of it. And I won't tolerate your interference." "You may own the land, Jedediah," Sarah said, her voice unwavering, "but you don't own these girls. And you certainly don't own me." He let out a harsh laugh, the sound echoing in the stillness of the morning. "You're a fool, schoolteacher. A naive, meddling fool." He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "Cease your interference, Sarah. Turn these girls over to me. It's for their own good, and for yours." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threat. The girls behind Sarah whimpered softly, their small bodies trembling. But Sarah didn't back down. She met his gaze, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "I won't abandon them, Jedediah," she said, her voice low but firm. "Not to you. Not to anyone." Jedediah stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and hard. Then he straightened up, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Very well, Sarah," he said softly. "Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when everything falls apart. When your precious little schoolhouse burns to the ground." He turned and walked away, his men following close behind, their shadows stretching long and ominous across the dusty ground. Sarah watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest, a cold fear gripping her gut. She knew Jedediah's threat wasn't empty. She knew he was capable of anything. But she also knew she couldn't back down. She couldn't abandon the girls to his mercy. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. The quiet defiance in her eyes hardened into resolve. She would protect these girls, no matter the cost. The saloon door swung inward, revealing Cole framed against the harsh midday sun. Dust motes danced in the light, momentarily obscuring his features. He stepped inside, the quiet click of the latch echoing in the sudden hush. Jedediah, mid-stride towards his waiting horse, paused, his back still to the saloon. He sensed the change in the air, the sudden stillness that preceded a storm. Cole walked towards the bar, his movements deliberate, his gaze fixed on the chipped shot glass the barkeep nervously polished. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Jedediah's presence. He simply ordered a whiskey, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice that carried the weight of silence and unspoken things. Jedediah turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they settled on Cole. "You," he said, his voice laced with a cold disdain. "You're the drifter, the one who's been sniffing around my town." Cole took a slow sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was a challenge in itself. "I hear you've taken an interest in the schoolteacher," Jedediah continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "In her little charity project." Cole finally met Jedediah's gaze, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, unwavering. He placed the shot glass on the bar, the sound sharp and clear in the tense silence. "She's a good woman," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Doing what's right." Jedediah let out a short, harsh laugh. "Right? Harboring savages? Defying me? That's not right. That's foolish." "Maybe," Cole said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel beneath it. "But she's got more guts than any man I've met in this town, including you." The silence that followed was thick with tension. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Jedediah's men, still holding his horse's reins, shifted uneasily, their hands hovering near their holsters. Jedediah stared at Cole, his eyes blazing with fury. He wanted to lash out, to crush this insolent drifter who dared to challenge him. But something held him back. A flicker of uncertainty, perhaps. A recognition of the quiet strength that emanated from the man standing before him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew this wasn't the time, not the place. But he also knew this wasn't over. He turned back towards his horse, his voice low and menacing as he spoke. "This town ain't big enough for the both of us, Drifter," he said, his words hanging in the air like a curse. "You'd best remember that." He mounted his horse and rode off, his men trailing behind him like silent shadows. The tension in the saloon slowly dissipated, replaced by a hushed murmur of speculation. Cole finished his whiskey, his gaze fixed on the dusty street where Jedediah had disappeared. He knew this was just the beginning. He knew Jedediah would be back. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that Sarah was caught in the crossfire. The desert night unfolded like a dark velvet cloth, studded with a million glittering diamonds. The air, cooled by the setting sun, carried the scent of sagebrush and dust. Sarah sat on the porch of the schoolhouse, a worn blanket draped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of star-dusted sky. The girls were asleep inside, their soft breaths the only sound in the stillness. She felt a weariness settle deep in her bones, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of constantly looking over her shoulder, of living under the shadow of Jedediah's threat. A soft creak of the porch swing beside her announced Cole's arrival. He sat down, the swing barely moving beneath his weight. He didn't speak, simply offered her a tin cup filled with steaming coffee. She accepted it gratefully, the warmth spreading through her chilled hands. They sat in silence, the only sound the gentle clinking of the tin against her teeth as she sipped the coffee. "He'll be back," Sarah said finally, her voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the night. Cole nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I know. I'm scared, Cole," she admitted, the words catching in her throat. "Not for myself, but for the girls." He turned to her, his eyes, reflecting the starlight, filled with a quiet understanding. "I won't let anything happen to them, Sarah. Or to you." His words, simple and direct, held a weight that reassured her more than any grand pronouncements could have. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since had arrived in Salvation. She saw the lines etched into his face, the weariness in his eyes, the quiet strength that emanated from his very being. She saw a man who had seen too much, endured too much, yet still retained a core of decency, of unwavering resolve. "Why, Cole?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping us?" He looked away, his gaze returning to the starlit sky. "Sometimes," he said after a long pause, "you just gotta do what's right." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any grand explanations or heroic pronouncements. And in that silence, in the simplicity of his words, Sarah understood. He wasn't looking for praise or reward. He was simply doing what he believed in, what his conscience dictated. And in that desolate, unforgiving landscape, that simple act of decency was a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. They sat in silence for a long time, the vast desert sky a silent witness to their shared vulnerability, their shared purpose. The weight of Jedediah's threat still hung heavy in the air, but beneath it, a new feeling began to bloom. A feeling of connection, of shared resilience, of hope flickering in the darkness. The desert moon, hanging low in the sky, cast a silver glow over the landscape, bathing the world in an ethereal light. And in that moment, under the vast expanse of the desert sky, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she was missing. A sense of belonging, of finding solace in the shared silence of a kindred spirit. The West remained wild, unforgiving, but under that desert moon, a small seed of hope had been planted, a fragile promise of a new beginning. The coffee had gone cold in the tin cups. The moon climbed higher, bleaching the desert landscape to a ghostly silver. Sarah drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the chill settling deep in her bones. It wasn't just the desert night that chilled her, but a deeper, more insidious cold, a cold fear that gnawed at her gut. "Jedediah isn't the only one," she said, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. Cole turned to her, his gaze questioning, patient. He didn't push. He waited for her to speak, to unravel the burden she carried. He uses them," she continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The girls. He uses them and then discards them like broken toys." Cole's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. He understood, had seen enough darkness in his travels to fill a lifetime, had seen the cruelty men were capable of, the way they preyed on the weak and vulnerable. "But it's not just him," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "It's the sheriff. Sheriff Brody. He protects Jedediah, turns a blind eye, takes his share." Cole remained silent, absorbing her words, letting them sink in. Had sensed something wasn't right about Brody, a certain slickness beneath the veneer of authority. Had seen the way Brody deferred to Jedediah, the almost imperceptible flicker of fear in his eyes. I tried to talk to the marshal in Dry Gulch," Sarah confessed, her voice trembling. "Sent him a letter, detailing everything. But Brody intercepted it. He threatened me, Cole. Said if I ever spoke out again, he'd make sure I regretted it." She looked at Cole, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "He'll kill me, Cole. He'll kill me and those girls if he thinks we'll expose him." Cole reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch surprisingly gentle. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He simply held her hand, the warmth of his touch a silent promise of support, of protection. "He won't touch you," he said finally, his voice low and rough, but with an underlying steel that resonated with conviction. "Not while I'm here." He squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "We'll figure this out, Sarah. We'll find a way." He didn't know how yet, but he would. Head face down worse odds, stared death in the face and walked away. He wouldn't let this woman, this brave, defiant schoolteacher, be crushed by the weight of Jedediah's and Brody's corruption. He wouldn't let those innocent girls be sacrificed on the altar of their greed and depravity. The desert night stretched on, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind and the soft crackle of the dying embers in the nearby fire pit. But in that shared silence, a new kind of strength began to grow, a quiet determination forged in the crucible of fear and desperation. The odds were stacked against them, the dangers very real. But they weren't alone. They had each other. And in that desolate, unforgiving landscape, that was enough. The first streaks of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, casting long, skeletal shadows across the desert. Cole saddled his horse, the familiar creak of leather and the metallic jingle of the bit a stark counterpoint to the quiet stillness of the morning. Sarah watched him, her heart a knot of fear and fragile hope. She knew what he was about to do, the risks he was taking. "You don't have to do this, Cole," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his gaze steady, unflinching. "Someone has to," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking beneath his weight. He leaned down, his hand briefly covering hers. "Pack what you need, Sarah," he instructed. "Just the essentials." She nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. He wasn't just going to Dry Gulch, he was taking them with him. He was giving them a chance to escape Jedediah's clutches, to build a new life, far away from salvation's poisonous shadow. Within an hour, they were riding. Sarah and the girls nestled amongst their meager belongings in the back of a sturdy wagon Cole had procured. They rode in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. They reached Dry Gulch just as the midday sun beat down with merciless intensity. The town, a cluster of dusty buildings huddled around a muddy watering hole, seemed to shimmer in the heat. Cole led them to a small, unassuming boarding house on the edge of town, the kind of place that offered anonymity and discretion. He left Sarah and the girls settled in a small, sparsely furnished room, promising to return as soon as he could. He headed towards the marshal's office, his steps measured, his gaze sweeping the street, taking in every detail, every nuance of the town's atmosphere. The marshal, a grizzled veteran named Hayes, listened to Cole's story with a mixture of skepticism and growing concern. He knew Jedediah's reputation, the reach of his influence, had heard whispers of the schoolteacher and salvation, the rumors of her defiance, of Jedediah's wrath. "Proof, son," Hayes said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "That's what I need. Proof, not just whispers and rumors." Cole nodded, understanding. He knew he was asking a lot, asking this man to go up against a powerful and ruthless man like Jedediah. But he also knew that Hayes was a man of integrity, a man who believed in justice. "He'll get it," Cole said, his voice quiet but resolute. "He'll get you the proof you need." He turned to leave, his mind already racing, piecing together the fragments of information he'd gathered, searching for the key that would unlock the truth, the evidence that would bring Jedediah and Brody to justice. He stepped back out into the blinding sun, the dust swirling around his boots, the weight of Sarah's fear, the girl's vulnerability, heavy on his shoulders. The West, he knew, offered no easy answers, no simple solutions. But he also knew that sometimes, even in the darkest corners of the world, a single spark of courage could ignite a fire of justice. The canyon walls rose around them like jagged teeth, the sun a sliver of burning gold in the narrow strip of sky above. The air, thick with the scent of pine and dust, hung heavy and still. Cole had chosen this route deliberately, a shortcut back to Dry Gulch, a path known only to a few. Had hoped to avoid Jedediah's men, but had underestimated the rancher's reach, his ruthlessness. The first shot cracked through the stillness, echoing off the canyon walls. The horses whinnied in terror, the wagon lurching violently as a bullet ripped through the canvas. Sarah screamed, her arms instinctively wrapping around the girls, shielding them with her own body. Cole reacted instantly, his hand snaking to his holster, drawing his Colt with a fluid, practiced motion. He returned fire, the roar of his gun shattering the silence, the smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. "Stay down," he yelled to Sarah, his voice tight with urgency. The ambush was well planned, the attackers positioned on the high ground, their rifles spitting lead with deadly accuracy. Cole knew they were outnumbered, outgunned. He needed it to level the playing field, to find some kind of advantage. "Get the girls out," he shouted, firing another shot, forcing one of the attackers to duck for cover. "Head for the rocks." Sarah, her face pale but resolute, scrambled out of the wagon, pulling the terrified girls with her. They stumbled towards a cluster of boulders, the only cover available in the exposed canyon. Cole kept firing, providing covering fire, his movements precise and economical, every shot carefully aimed. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever, but he had to buy Sarah and the girls enough time to escape. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a bullet grazed his flesh. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the burning sensation, his focus unwavering. He had to keep them safe. That was all that mattered. He saw Sarah and the girls reach the rocks, their small figures disappearing into the shadows. He breathed a sigh of relief, a small measure of solace in the midst of the chaos. Now, he had to find a way out. He ducked behind the overturned wagon, using it as a makeshift shield. He assessed the situation, his mind racing, searching for an escape route. The canyon walls offered little cover, the attackers closing in, their shadows lengthening in the afternoon sun. He knew he couldn't stay put. He had to move, to create confusion, to disrupt their rhythm. He took a deep breath, gathering his strength, his resolve hardening in the face of danger. He was a survivor, had been in tighter spots before, had found a way out. He would find a way to keep Sarah and the girls safe, even if it meant putting his own life on the line. He burst from behind the wagon, sprinting towards the nearest cluster of rocks, his boots kicking up dust, his Colt blazing. He caught one of the attackers off guard, dropping him with a clean shot. The others, momentarily surprised by his sudden move, hesitated, giving him the precious seconds he needed. He scrambled up the rocks, using the uneven terrain to his advantage, his movements agile and fluid. He reached a narrow crevice, a natural chimney leading to the top of the canyon wall. He squeezed through the narrow opening, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He emerged onto the rim of the canyon, the vast expanse of the desert stretching before him. He could see the attackers below, fanning out, searching for him. He knew he couldn't stay there. He was too exposed. He had to find Sarah and the girls, make sure they were safe. He found them huddled beneath an overhanging rock, their faces streaked with dust and tears, their bodies trembling with fear. Sarah held the girls close, her eyes wide with terror, her voice barely a whisper. "Cole, they almost." He knelt beside her, his hand gently stroking her hair, his voice low and soothing. "It's all right, Sarah. We're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. They were still in danger, still hunted. He had to get them out of there, find a place where they could hide, where Jedediah's men couldn't reach them. He helped Sarah to her feet, his arms supporting her, his gaze scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of pursuit. They started to move slowly, cautiously, their shadows lengthening in the late afternoon sun. They walked for hours, the desert stretching before them, vast and unforgiving. The girls, exhausted and frightened, stumbled along beside them, their small hands clinging to Sarah's skirt. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long skeletal shadows across the sand. They reached a small sheltered alcove in the canyon wall, a natural refuge from the wind and the encroaching darkness. Cole helped Sarah and the girls settle down, gathering what little firewood he could find, building a small fire to ward off the chill of the desert night. As the flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, Sarah turned to Cole, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "They'll find us, Cole," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't give up." Cole looked at her, his gaze steady, unflinching. Not if I can help it, he replied, his voice quiet but firm. Just then, the sound of horses' hooves echoed through the canyon, drawing closer. Jedediah's men had found them. Sarah's heart sank, fear gripping her like a vise. She knew this was the end. The riders appeared at the mouth of the alcove, their faces grim, their rifles raised. Leading them was a man named Caleb, a hardened veteran of countless range wars, a man known for his ruthlessness, his unwavering loyalty to Jedediah. He dismounted, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "Jedediah wants you back, schoolma'am," he said, his voice cold and hard. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes meeting Caleb's, her voice surprisingly steady. "Please, Caleb," she pleaded, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "You have a daughter. Think of her. Think of what Jedediah does to these girls. How can you be a part of this?" Caleb's eyes flickered, a flicker of doubt, of uncertainty. He glanced at the girls huddled beside Sarah, their small faces pale and drawn in the firelight. He thought of his own daughter, safe and sound back home. He swallowed hard, the image of her innocent face clashing with the harsh reality of the situation. "Jedediah, he ain't a man to be crossed," Caleb muttered, his voice strained. "He's a monster, Caleb," Sarah said, her voice rising, gaining strength. "And you're helping him. You're complicit in his crimes." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Sarah and his men. He felt a tightness in his chest, a growing unease. Had always followed Jedediah's orders without question, but now, looking at Sarah, at the fear in her eyes, he felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of conscience he hadn't felt in years. Cole watched the exchange, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt, his gaze never leaving Caleb. He sensed a shift in the man, a crack in his hardened exterior. He knew this was their only chance. "Caleb," Cole said, his voice quiet but firm, "you have a choice. You can continue to follow a man who preys on the innocent, or you can do what's right. You can help us." Caleb looked at Cole, then back at Sarah. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the plea for mercy. He saw the quiet strength in Cole's stance, the unwavering determination in his gaze. He took a deep breath, a decision forming in his mind, a decision that would change the course of their lives. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll help you." He turned to his men, his voice regaining its authority. "We're leaving," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. The men hesitated, their faces etched with confusion. They'd never heard Caleb defy Jedediah before. "You heard me," Caleb snapped, his hand moving towards his own holster. "We're done here." The men, sensing the steel in his voice, reluctantly obeyed, mounting their horses and turning back the way they'd come. Caleb looked at Cole, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Take the North Trail," he said, his voice low. "It'll lead you to the border. Jedediah won't follow you there." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Sarah. "I'm sorry, Ma'am," he said, his voice tinged with regret, "for what I almost did." Then he turned and rode away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Sarah and Cole alone in the flickering firelight. Sarah watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She looked at Cole, her eyes shining with tears. He helped us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Cole nodded, his hand gently squeezing her shoulder. "He did," he said, his voice soft. They stood there for a moment, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft murmur of the wind. Then they turned and started to pack, their movements quick and efficient, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope. The North Trail awaited, a path to freedom, a chance to start anew. The West remained wild, unforgiving, but tonight, In the heart of the desert, a small act of mercy had softened its harsh edges, offering a glimmer of light in the darkness. They rode through the star-streaked night, the North Trail winding through canyons and arroyos. Sarah held the reins loosely, her body aching, her mind racing. Caleb's unexpected mercy had bought them time, but it hadn't erased the threat. Jedediah wouldn't forget. She glanced at Cole, his silhouette a dark, reassuring presence against the pale moon. He hadn't spoken since they left the alcove, his silence heavier than usual. They reached the border town of Redemption just as dawn painted the sky a bruised purple. Redemption. The name felt ironic, a cruel joke in the face of all they'd endured. The town was small, a handful of dusty buildings huddled around a saloon. The air thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. They found a room at the edge of town, a cramped space with a single window overlooking the endless expanse of the prairie. The girls, exhausted and traumatized, fell into a fitful sleep. Sarah sat by the window, watching the sun rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. She felt a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion. She had lost everything: her husband, her home, her sense of security. But she hadn't lost her will to protect her daughters. That fire still burned within her, a flicker of defiance in the face of despair. Cole entered the room, his movements quiet, his gaze fixed on her. He held a small leather-bound book in his hand. "Found this in the wagon," he said, his voice low, gravelly, hidden under the floorboards. Sarah took the book, her fingers tracing the worn leather. It was her husband's journal. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart pounding in her chest. The entries chronicled her husband's dealings, his debts, his desperation. But then, something caught her eye. A name. Reverend Ezekiel, the preacher from Dry Gulch. A man known for his piety, his charitable works. The man who had conducted her husband's funeral. The entries revealed a shocking truth. Reverend Ezekiel wasn't the saintly figure he pretended to be. He was a con man, a swindler, preying on the vulnerable, using their faith to line his own pockets. Had been in cahoots with Jedediah, using the church as a front for their illegal activities. Her husband had been caught in their web, his debts mounting, his desperation growing. Had tried to expose them, to warn others, but they'd silenced him. Sarah closed the journal, her hand trembling. She felt a wave of nausea, the realization of the preacher's deceit hitting her like a physical blow. She looked at Cole, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "He killed him, Cole," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The preacher, he killed my husband." Cole's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Had suspected something wasn't right about the preacher, about the circumstances surrounding her husband's death. Now, the truth was laid bare, stark and ugly. "Well, expose him, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Well, bring him to justice." Sarah looked at him, a flicker of hope igniting in her eyes. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that Jedediah and the preacher wouldn't go down without a fight. But she also knew she wasn't alone. She had Cole, and together they would fight for justice, for the memory of her husband, for the future of her daughters. The west remained wild. The desert wind whipped through Dry Gulch, swirling dust devils down the main street. High noon. The church bell tolled, its mournful clang echoing through the tense silence. Cole stood at the far end of the street, his shadow long and lean against the dusty ground. He hadn't slept. Sarah's grief, the girl's quiet fear, and the simmering rage within him had kept him awake. He held her husband's journal, its worn leather a testament to the secrets it held. Across the street, the church doors opened, and Reverend Ezekiel emerged, his black coat billowing in the wind, his face a mask of pious serenity. He paused on the steps, his gaze sweeping over the small gathering of townsfolk, their faces etched with curiosity and apprehension. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice smooth, resonant. "We are gathered here today." Cole cut him off, his voice low, but carrying across the silent street. "You're a liar, Ezekiel." The preacher's serene mask cracked. His eyes narrowed, his lips tightening into a thin line. The townsfolk gasped, murmuring amongst themselves. Cole stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt. "You prey on the weak, Ezekiel. You use their faith to steal from them, to destroy them." "These are vile accusations," Ezekiel retorted, his voice regaining its composure. "The devil speaks through this man. Do not listen to his lies." Cole held up the journal, its pages fluttering in the wind. "Your name is in here, Ezekiel, along with Jedediah's. Your partnership in crime is documented, page after page." The preacher's eyes darted towards the journal, a flicker of fear betraying his carefully crafted facade. He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching inside his coat. "Don't," Cole warned, his voice hard. "Don't make me draw." The townsfolk watched in stunned silence, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. They trusted Ezekiel, revered him. Now, the truth stood before them, raw and ugly. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. She held a small worn Bible in her hand, the same Bible her husband had carried with him everywhere. "You swore on this Bible, Ezekiel," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You swore to uphold God's word. You swore to protect the innocent." She opened the Bible, her finger pointing to a passage. "What does it say, Ezekiel?" "Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not kill." The preacher's face was ashen. He looked at Sarah, then at the townsfolk, their faces a mixture of disbelief and anger. He knew he was trapped. His carefully constructed world of lies was crumbling around him. He made a desperate move, his hand darting inside his coat, but Cole was faster. The roar of his Colt shattered the silence. The preacher staggered back, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. He collapsed onto the church steps, the dust swirling around him, his body slowly settling into the stillness of death. The townsfolk stood frozen, the echo of the gunshot ringing in their ears. The wind howled through Dry Gulch, a mournful lament for a town betrayed, for a truth revealed. The West remained wild, justice rough and swift. But in the heart of the desert, a small seed of truth had been planted, a testament to the courage of a woman who dared to speak, and a silent rancher who dared to act. The dust settled, leaving a gritty film over everything. Sarah stood beside Cole, her hand gripping his arm, the Bible clutched tight in her other hand. The townsfolk slowly began to stir, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. Justice had been served, swift and brutal, but the air still crackled with unease. Jedediah. He was still out there. A week later, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, his horse moving slowly, wearily. It was Jedediah. He looked different. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He dismounted in front of Sarah, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of shame in their depths. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low, gravelly. His gaze shifted to the small wooden crosses marking the graves of the Apache women head-wronged. He knelt before them, his head bowed. I didn't know." Sarah watched him, her heart a knot of conflicting emotions. Anger, grief, and a flicker of something akin to pity. Shed hated him, feared him. But now, seeing him humbled, broken, she felt a strange sense of emptiness. They were good women, Jedediah, she said, her voice quiet. They deserve better. Jedediah nodded, his head still bowed. "I'll make it right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll help rebuild their homes. I'll provide for their families." He stood up, his gaze meeting Sarah's again. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with regret. "For everything." He turned to Cole, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You did what was right," he said. "I won't forget it." He offered his hand to Cole, a gesture of reconciliation. Cole hesitated, then took Jedediah's hand, his grip firm but not unkind. The West was a place of hard men, but also a place where redemption, however unlikely, could sometimes be found. Jedediah kept his word. He used his resources to help the Apache families, rebuilding their homes, providing for their needs. He became a quiet presence in the community, his actions speaking louder than any words could. Sarah and her daughters started to rebuild their lives. The girls, still bearing the scars of their ordeal, slowly began to heal, their laughter echoing through the small house they'd found in redemption. Sarah found solace in the simple routines of daily life, in the quiet strength of the community that had embraced them. Cole stayed. He helped Sarah rebuild, helped her create a sense of normalcy for her daughters. He became a part of their lives, a quiet protector, a silent source of strength. He never spoke of love, but his actions spoke volumes. Had found a place to belong, a purpose beyond the wandering life had known. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah and Cole sat on the porch, watching the girls play in the yard. "He really changed, didn't he?" Sarah said, her voice soft. Cole nodded, his gaze fixed on the girls, their laughter a melody in the twilight air. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, "even the wildest heart can be tamed." The West remained wild, unforgiving. But in the small town of Redemption, a flicker of hope had taken root, a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness, the quiet strength of resilience, and the enduring promise of a new beginning. The wind whispered through the prairie grass, a lullaby to the setting sun. Redemption, once a town choked by dust and despair, was slowly breathing again. New homes were being built, families reuniting, a fragile sense of community taking root. The Apache families, once displaced and grieving, were finding their footing, their traditions weaving back into the fabric of the town. Jedediah, his face etched with the weight of his past, worked alongside them, his silence a testament to his remorse, his actions a slow, steady penance. Sarah watched it all from her porch, a quiet smile playing on her lips. The girls, their faces scrubbed clean, their hair neatly braided, chased fireflies in the twilight, their laughter a melody that echoed through the stillness. The echoes of gunshots, of fear and loss were fading, replaced by the gentle hum of life returning. Cole stood beside her, his silhouette a dark, reassuring presence against the fading light. He was packed, his saddlebags filled with the few possessions he carried with him. His horse, a sturdy Appaloosa, stood patiently by the hitching post, its breath misting in the cool evening air. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly. Sarah nodded, her gaze lingering on the girls, their faces lit by the flickering fireflies. "Yes," she said, her voice soft. "It's time." She turned to him, her eyes meeting his, a silent understanding passing between them. They'd found something precious in redemption, a sense of belonging, a shared purpose. But the West called to them, its vastness a promise of new beginnings, new horizons. They rode out of redemption as the first stars began to appear, the trail stretching before them, a ribbon of moonlight winding through the endless prairie. They didn't speak, their silence comfortable, familiar. The girls were asleep, nestled safely in the wagon, their dreams untroubled by the shadows of the past. They rode through the night, the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves, a steady drum against the silence. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. The moon, a silver disk in the inky sky, cast long dancing shadows across the land. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, they reached the crest of a hill. Below them, the land stretched out, a vast panorama of rolling hills, shimmering rivers, and distant mountains. The west, in all its wild, untamed beauty, lay before them. Sarah reined in her horse, her gaze sweeping over the landscape, a sense of awe filling her. Beside her, Cole did the same, his eyes mirroring her own. They had left behind the ghosts of the past, the pain and the loss. They were riding towards a new future, a future filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. They rode on, their silhouettes small against the vastness of the land, two souls bound together by the shared experience of loss and redemption, their journey a testament to the enduring human spirit, their destination unknown, but their hearts filled with the quiet promise of a new beginning. The West remained wild, but within its wildness, a small seed of hope had taken root, carried on the wind, whispering the promise of a new dawn.